Okay, I think we are live. As always, double checking that everything works, that you can hear me, that you can see me. And I'm just grabbing some info here for my notes for today. We kind of have more of a lesson type stream today, as I wanted to have just a more of an opportunity to share some of what I learned with you. Okay, it seems to be working. Perfect. Hello, everyone. So as I said in the explanation to the stream, today I wanted to take a bit of a different approach. I wanted to share with you some things that I learned about DevOps and really kind of break it down to you from more non-technical point of view, because DevOps is a technical approach. There are a lot of engineering practices that are associated with that. But after reading the book, it feels that it's something that we definitely need to know. Hi, Helen. Hello, hello. Yeah, so anyway, I read this book. It took me such a long time because I wanted to make sure that I take the notes, that everything, is well written for myself, and I actually know what it all is. And then I started to create in the video, and it just got so long. Oh, hello from Nigeria. What time is it in Nigeria? It's got to be a bit late during the day. Okay. So as always, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We do have a little delay here or there, so just be mindful of that. But apart from that, everything should be kind of always give me an opportunity to answer some of your questions. I might not see them right away, but I'll try to answer whenever I see them in the chat. So use the chat, let me know. And let's jump into today's topic, which is DevOps, right? The DevOps Handbook. And I have already created a couple of videos on this topic, right? We talk about the role of the Scrum Master. Oh, it's after 4 p.m. Hi, Mark from Ontario. Oh, you're not too far from me. And I talked about kind of what technical knowledge a Scrum Master would need. We talked about the technical debt. And then DevOps, right? This is one of those important terminology, really, that we need to know, I believe, as Scrum Masters, whether we're technical or not. And you also don't have to be technical to be able to help your team implement some of those practices. At least that's what I think. Experimental space. Hello. Oh, from UK. Great. We have people from all over. That is nice to see. Thank you for joining. Awesome. Now, what do you know about DevOps? Well, I think, at least for me, when I was thinking about like what DevOps is, when I was hearing that, for me, it was always something very, very technical. And in a way it is. We'll see that. But it is also something that brings in a lot of the practices that are very important for any agile team or more agile organization in general. And that is why, if we are trying to help our teams become more effective, that's kind of something that definitely has to be in our toolbox, right? To be able to understand that. Hello from Spain, Randall. Rashmi from Hyderabad. Okay, I'm not sure where it is, so might need to look it up on the map. Okay, so development plus operations. Yeah, so basically the term itself comes from dev plus ops. But there are a lot of myths associated with what it is. Now, if you go on Google, there's Angel from Barcelona, Spain. If you go on Google and you say, okay, what is DevOps? Find me a class, find me a certification. What you will find is a huge amount of technical terminology. Most of the classes, I went on Udemy, I went on Coursera, and I'm like, okay, let me find some courses on this topic. And most of them were super technical. So I even have this little image that I found. If you just kind of search for DevOps overall, you find a lot of images that, let me show you. Okay, yeah, so you find a lot of images like that, right? So you see all of these things: GitLab, AWS, Docker, Ansible, Kubernetes, Grafana, OpenStack, Gradle, all of these things. And this is kind of how it is shown. Like a lot of the times when we are looking for DevOps, I just put in DevOps in here. We see all of these tools. And so when we're looking for, okay, a course or something like that, we find mostly things like how to set up Kubernetes, how to create containers in this tool, and all of these things. And I'm not a developer. I don't want to know that stuff. What I want to know is how can I help my team get to those tools and start using them, to their advantage. And that was my biggest question, to be honest. We have, going back to the chat, we have so many people. We have Cam Lash from Ottawa, also not too far. We have Florian from Vietnam, someone from Pakistan. Oh, it must be really late in Pakistan and Vietnam. I'm just realizing it. In India, we have Jasmine and London and Brazil. Nice. This is awesome. Welcome, welcome. What was I talking about? Yeah. It's going to be an interesting stream. I'm going to be jumping in and out of the chat. And so I started to look into that more. And I had this book, DevOps Handbook, and I started looking into, like, is that the book that is supposed to teach me what DevOps is? And yes, actually, people who have created it, specifically Patrick Dubois, are the creators of DevOps, right? Patrick Dubois is the first person who used the term DevOps in one of the conferences. I think he created a conference called DevOps Days, and that's kind of where it's coming from. And so I thought, look, if these are the people who have kind of created the concept, they definitely should know what it is. And yes, they do. So what are some of the things that we definitely would like to know about DevOps? So first of all, when I was looking up all of that stuff, I'm like, I'm reading this book and it talks about cultural practices, not just technical stuff. And so I wasn't confused because when you search online, it's only technical stuff. When you look into this book, it's cultural and technical. And so I asked a question to the people I used to work with, some cloud engineers. And I'm like, hey, what is DevOps? Because I'm very confused on what it is. And what they said, one of them actually replied to me and said, when I asked, like, is DevOps supposed to be a cultural practice plus technical practice? Or is it just like setting up Kubernetes or like containers? And one of the people I used to work with said, that's what DevOps is supposed to be, cultural and technical practices, but it has been bastardized over the years to be just CI/CD specialists, where CI/CD is continuous integration, continuous development, deployment. Oh, it's in India. Okay, Ismail from India. Have someone from Cameroon. Hello, hello. So that kind of gave me all of the information, saying, okay, well, obviously technical people are focusing a lot on the technical stuff, but we're not technical. We can focus on the cultural stuff. And so if we were to kind of say, what is DevOps? When you look into the book, it doesn't really give you a very good explanation to what it is, like it's not one statement. That's not, retract that. It gives you a good explanation. It doesn't give you one statement that just tells you, hey, here's what DevOps is. But I found this definition that I think really encompasses everything that DevOps is. I'm going to post it into the chat. It's too long. Okay. I'm going to post half of it into the chat. Okay. For us to kind of read through it together. Okay. I had to split it into 3 times. So DevOps is the combination of cultural philosophies, practices, and tools that increases an organization's ability to deliver applications and services at high velocity or at high speed, evolving and improving products at a faster pace than organizations using traditional software development and infrastructure management processes. This speed enables organizations to better serve their customers and compete more effectively in the market. All of these things seem very familiar, don't they? We hear that when we talk about Agile. We hear that when we talk about Scrum, Kanban. Like a lot of those Agile practices and frameworks are talking about the same thing. We are trying with this framework to help the organization build better products that customers want to buy, customers want to use. And also we are considering the well-being of the employees, not only just kind of delivering product and burning out everyone who is working for the company. And so DevOps comes back to not only the technical practices, but to the cultural practices as well. So what I want to do is actually open up a little thing here so that I can actually show you. I've connected. Yeah. So DevOps is kind of, sounds like Scrum. You know what, Ricardo? A lot of the things that I read in here, I was actually taking notes, and I'm like, that's literally the same thing in Scrum that, it's very similar. It's like basically the same thing as this thing that we do in Scrum. A lot of it is very, very similar. So DevOps is, the way we can look at it, it is kind of split into 3 ways, and they actually call them 3 ways. And those are like the underpinning principles of DevOps. And those principles are the principles of flow, and making sure I'm saying it correctly. So the first way are the principles of flow. The second way are the principles of feedback. And the third way are the principles of continual learning and experimentation. Flow, feedback, continuous improvement. Sounds very familiar. Again, we know what it is. We have already seen it. Is my application working? Apparently not. Okay. And so you saw that I have shown you that image there with like little sign, right? And that is what you will find when you're actually looking for kind of DevOps and what it is. That will be the sign that you find. But if you actually are not, if you're looking into the book itself, you're not going to find this image. This infinity sign doesn't exist. Connect app. Okay, accept. Perfect. Yeah, I just wanted to show you a bit of that. Okay, perfect. Yeah. Great. And so what they have, right? You've seen this graph that I showed you, right? If we were to kind of look for DevOps, which is this sign, right? And basically it says, let's put in this one, we kind of do it continuously. That's the continuous part. So we deploy, operate, monitor, we plan, code, build, right? And so we continuously do that cycle. That's kind of the point of feedback and continuous learning. And so in the book, the way they kind of talk about it is a bit different, right? So they say, this is business. And they say, well, business is technically development. So basically the product team, like the product team who are working on building the product. On the other side, we have the customer, right? And the customer is often represented by operations, right? Basically people who interact with the customer, who are getting the complaints or requests coming from the customer to them. And often those two are kind of sitting on two different sides, right? They're in a way against each other, like kind of working against each other. Because development, they want to, well, like not even development, but business, the product side, they want to deliver as many features as possible. They want to produce as much as possible. On the other side, customer and ops, they want to have a stable system, right? And so that it creates kind of a tension between the two. And so what they want to actually say with DevOps, we're trying to connect them, right? We are trying to connect these two. And so in here, we say, this is the first way. Flow. Right? So we saw that principles of flow. Then on top of that, so we kind of have the flow of work coming from development and ending up in ops, right? Then we have the second way, which is here. And that is feedback. And that kind of creates the feedback loop between the customers, operations, and the development. And then inside of it, we have as kind of the way they draw it is kind of like this. And this is the third way. And I don't have space to kind of write it up. But the third way is the principles of continuous learning and experimentation. So this image is actually the representation of DevOps. It's not that other image that we saw, which is the kind of this came later, I think, right? Great. By the way, if anyone has any questions so far, let me know. So I should be able to close that. Okay, perfect. And so when we are talking about these three principles, the way they approach it, we have cultural practices or cultural changes that we want to create in the organization. And then we have the technical stuff, right? So technical practices that support those cultural changes. But you can't go there without cultural changes, actually. So you may implement a practice, but if inherently your team or your organization is not well aligned with what you are, what you're trying to implement, it's not going to work. So think about it as in Scrum, right? When we're implementing Scrum, the same as we would kind of looking at this graph with all Kubernetes and stuff and all of the things, right? And if it would be the same if we said, well, Scrum is just Jira, Slack, and GitHub, right? So this is what Scrum is. yes, those tools, those technical tools that we can implement to help us manage our workflow, to help us create visibility into our product backlog, they can be very helpful. But if behind that the culture is not actually supporting the principles of transparency, visibility, collaboration, then Jira becomes a very bad tool and everybody hates it, right? So that's kind of the same way. And so the technical practices are important, but we also need to work on that cultural aspect first. So I'm opening up my notes in here just to make sure that I have everything. Okay, yeah. So when we go to the principles of flow, we have some of the important parts that we definitely want to implement. So principles of flow, what are we trying to create? Well, we're trying to create visibility around everything that we do, our processes, right? So we want to have visibility over the flow of work. So we want to know what actually happens from the point of where we start, like the customer comes with a request and we give that work back into the customer's hands, right? And we're trying to understand what is happening in this process. Often when we look at the Scrum team, right? And I think this is where Scrum falls short. We look at the Scrum team and it's just part of this flow, part of this workflow. So the Scrum team finished, but then behind all of that work, there is, well, we need to do this kind of testing. We need to get 10,000 approvals. And then finally we can release, right? So that slows us down. In DevOps, we're trying to look at the whole cycle. So that's about visibility. They have limited work in progress limit. So we're trying to create limits on work in progress so that we can get items from one side to the other as fast as possible instead of having 10,000 things in progress. Sounds familiar. Sounds like those principles come from Kanban, and they actually are coming from Kanban. So those are the principles that just come directly from that method, the Kanban method, right? So we are limiting work in progress. We are trying to reduce batch sizes. So that's about splitting work into small value pieces. So where we are able to complete something, maybe it's very small value in on its own, but we're able to get it to done. Say, okay, this works with the rest of our system. Now we can continue with the next part, right? So small batches, that's the same. Comes from Agile, right? Also, because in Agile, we're trying to deliver frequently. Same thing. We're reducing the batch sizes so that we can deliver more frequently to the customer. Reducing the number of handoffs. And that's really about optimizing the workflow, right? So if we have, say, a requirements team, they first need to approve all of the requirements. Once this is done, they hand it off into the development team. The development team completes their part of the work, and then they hand off to the next team that is going to release it. That creates a lot of contention, a lot of problems, and potential risks for things not going our way. And so the principles of flow tell us we need to reduce the number of handoffs and have as much power stored within our development team as possible. So cross-functionality, we heard about that in Scrum. We heard about that in Agile principles too. All of these things, nothing is new. Then they talk about continually identifying and removing bottlenecks. And that comes from, once again, Kanban methods, from optimizing the workflow, where we're trying to understand which part of our process is becoming a bottleneck, right? And if this part becomes a bottleneck, what can we do to make it better? And the bottleneck is really identified by the part of the process that slows down, that cannot process as many items as we want as any other part of the process. Randall has a question here. Does DevOps use events similar to the Scrum events? Interestingly enough, there are no events in DevOps. apart maybe from the blameless post-mortem, but it's not like a process where they explain this is how you are going to run iterations. They don't have it. Like there is no events related to DevOps specifically. They encourage you to do blameless postmortems that I'll talk about. But apart from that, that's it. You know, it's more about principles, and then you decide how to implement them, you know? So we talked about bottlenecks. And then the last one, I love it, that comes also from Kanban and Lean management, and that is eliminate hardships and waste in the value stream. So in simple terms is stop doing things that don't bring value, you know, and that create misery within the teams and within the organization. That's pretty much what it means. And what I really like here is they actually define what is waste, what is wasteful, right? Because we often say, oh, we need to eliminate waste in the organization, in the team, in the work that we do. What's waste? Well, it is the use of any material or resource beyond what the customer requires and is willing to pay for. So if we are building something that nobody wants, for example, nobody cares about, this is waste. If no one is ready to pay for it, if no one is going to use it, it's waste. We have to eliminate it. And that comes back to if we have a product backlog, if we're using Scrum, right, we need to delete all of this stuff and prioritize the most important stuff and remove everything that is not as important. That's pretty much what it is. So these are the principles of flow. And in the same, just to give us a bit of want to show, no, that's not what I want to show. I kind of want to show that present with share screen to have the notes. So these are the cultural practices, right? Connect to app, accept. Okay. Here are my wonderful notes. I was really quick. Yeah, and so here are the principles of flow that I just talked about, right? Work in progress limits, make your work visible, reduce batch sizes, reduce the number of handoffs, continually identify and elevate constraints or bottlenecks, and eliminate hardships and waste in the value stream. So these are the principles of flow. So that's kind of one thing, one part of our little diagram, right? Okay, so the next part would be the principles of feedback. And I'll just keep it in here. So the principles of feedback, the same. What are some of the things that we want to kind of add in here? Well, first, how do we connect dev and ops? Well, we are trying to make actually it distracts me that I have this on my screen. So principles of feedback. Make quality everyone's responsibility. So you know that meme where it's ops problem now, DevOps memes. I think if you just look for DevOps memes, will I find it? Yeah, so this is the one I'm talking about. It worked fine in dev, ops problem now, right? So this is the kind of relationships that is often created between development and operations, right? Where developers like, I finished it, it worked fine. Now I don't care if it's not working with the rest of it. So operations will figure it out, right? So I think that's kind of a very good meme that represents that relationship. And so the second principle of DevOps is to actually say, hey, we all are working on the same product. So everybody is responsible for the quality of that product, including you developers and including you operations, right? So we're trying to make sure that everybody actually is having the same goals set and the same responsibilities. So everybody is accountable for that quality. We are talking about making sure that people are not afraid to actually provide feedback, like don't shoot the messenger. Another thing, so we need to have a safe environment for failure, so that if people are finding issues or failing or like not finding the best ways to do something, they're not afraid to come and talk about it, right? To bring up those problems. The next one is see and report problems as they occur. Obviously, if we have a safe environment, we want people to talk about any kind of issues as soon as possible and not wait, right? Often what happens, right, someone would be, I'm thinking about like a Scrum team, right? And so someone might be stuck in one of the tasks they are doing. And so they'll say, I'll try to figure it out. So the first day comes, they can't figure it out. They come to the daily Scrum. Any blockers? No, everything's fine. Continue to figure it out on their own. The second day rolls in. The third day rolls in. Finally, they say, well, I actually was blocked for the past 4 days. Well, now we just lost 4 days. And I think that's kind of what we're trying to say here. When there is a problem and we see it, we need to report it immediately. And we need to say, okay, let's stop, let's reassess and make sure that we solve this problem before we actually continue, right? And that is another point in here in the principles of feedback. Swarm and solve problems to build new knowledge, right? Usually that basically means is if there is a problem, everybody, especially if it's a big problem, everybody stop doing whatever you're doing. We're all going to come together as a team, fix that problem, and then we'll continue with the rest of it. And I think that definitely is something that helps. Like, for example, right now I'm working with a team that has that kind of mentality where someone would get stuck. They immediately would talk about it, saying, I'm having a trouble with this. Okay, let's meet right after the daily Scrum and figure it out together. And that helps them fix those problems faster and kind of get back to the product work again. The more I talk, you'll see that a lot of this stuff is common sense. Then we have the find and fix problems in the area of control as part of the daily work. Basically, that means that don't escalate to 3 levels and then someone else, an architect from another team, is going to fix that. But instead, what you're trying to do is the people who are the closest to that work should be the people who help fix it or fix it because they have the most knowledge about it. And the last part is basically to prioritize non-functional work alongside functional work, right? So basically, it says create a culture where, or a process where operational and non-functional requirements are prioritized as highly as user features. So that's kind of the main point in here. And that is something what I talked about in the tech debt video, right? In that video, I said technical debt is as important as features, especially if it is something that can kind of bite us 3 months down the line. We want to fix it earlier before the disaster happens. So it's the same thing that says, make sure you actually optimize. Not only just we're delivering features, but we are also making sure that we deliver high quality. So those are the principles of feedback. Pretty straightforward, right? How to create an environment, a good environment for feedback. And the third one is the principles of continual learning and experimentation, right? And continuous improvement. We want to create a culture where we are able to try new things and fail. We talked about failure already, right? And so some of the things we want to do here, we want to make sure that in the organization itself, we have a culture of learning, trying out new things, And we have a culture where it's safe to fail. Again, we're coming back to those points. And there they do talk a lot about leaders, right? They say leaders reinforce the learning culture. So leaders themselves need to be, so true. Boris is saying, leaders need to be on the same page with everyone. It should come from leadership. Yes, we're trying to kind of build the both sides from bottom up, but from up to bottom, from top down, is that leaders need to be showing and encouraging people to try, and instead when failure happens, they need to be there to support people to learn from that failure, and not be that manager who is like, okay, you made a mistake, you're not getting your bonus at the end of the year. So, it's obviously an exaggeration, but kind of coming back to that learning culture. Then, under the same principles, we have institutionalized the improvement of daily work. Basically, reserve time to fix and improve, kind of like retrospectives. Okay, they don't have it as an event or a meeting in DevOps, but they say, hey, you need to make sure that you reserve the time to evaluate how things are going, and you find ways of improvement. Lots of developers will tell you we don't have time for retrospectives, but then they will say, yeah, DevOps is great, but then retrospectives are kind of part of DevOps almost, not in the same words, but, it says that you should be improving. I see a question from Randall, is not having the traditional manager. You mean that kind of not having the traditional manager in the organization? I think you still kind of have to have it, right? There is some administration that has to happen within an organization, so you will have a manager, but more of that manager taking on more of the role of a coach and mentor, rather than like a command and control type of manager, someone who helps employees, the people who work for them become better, grow, and that's kind of what it comes back to. Kind of management versus leadership, or more specifically, servant leadership, Then, in the same principles of continuous improvement, I'm going to call it continuous improvement, even though it's not exactly the terminology they use. Then they say, replace firefighting with process improvement. Okay, so I love it so much. That firefighting that constantly happens, right? And we basically get into this vicious cycle where there are problems, we need to fix them. And so then we say, oh, well, we don't have time to plan for it, to fix it for the future. We'll just fix this one thing, and then we need to finish all of the other features or whatever that is. We don't have time. And so that is the problem, is that basically brings us to that firefighting mode where there are fires everywhere, and we never plan ahead for removing the hazards before the fire starts, right? And so that's kind of what they're saying. Instead of trying to always fix one problem in one corner when the fire starts, instead we are looking at our whole process and we're trying to eliminate the potential for fire, right? And we improve our processes in advance. So process improvement, they're specific about that. I would say plan for that process improvement. That comes back to our product backlog and prioritizing non-functional requirements. It all comes back to the same concepts that make a lot of sense already. Then they have, very specifically, never punish for mistakes. They even say, take people who make mistakes, and instead of using them, hey, you should not be like John because John makes a lot of mistakes. Instead, take those people and say, this is now, you're the expert in this. You already made a mistake. What have you learned? please be the person who also helps others understand how not to make this mistake, right? And so they actually elevate people from those roles from like, they elevate people who make mistakes because they say, you are making mistakes. It means that you're taking risks, and it means that you're learning faster through those risks, through your mistakes. If you are learning, of course, we want to encourage learning. So never punish for mistakes. Take it as an opportunity for learning. And I talk about it. Like, I have a video on the failure. The same thing, right? Coming back to how do we encourage failure, pretty much, you know? Transform local knowledge into global improvements. Transform local tacit knowledge into global improvements. And that comes back to making sure that you have not extensive, but kind of in their way, looking at how they explain it, they kind of encourage a lot of documentation. Making it basically say, we made a mistake, we fixed something. That needs to be documented in some way so people can find it and learn from it, right? And so you have a very sophisticated wiki where you collect all of that information, especially when things are not going the right way, so that anyone can actually find this information, read through it, potentially find the solution to their problem there. And so that's kind of one of the things here. And the last one here is what they say, continually introduce tension to elevate performance. And that basically means that, you know, like a lot of companies, big known companies would have like, actually would try to break their system on purpose so that they can identify potential risky areas in their product and fix that before the problem actually occurs. So that's kind of what it comes back to, as in, we want to kind of test our problem, like poke at it and see if there are any gaps that we actually fix them and fill them in. So those are the principles, the 3 ways. And these are just the cultural practices that I talked about, right? And it all starts there. And so this part is where I think we, as Scrum Masters, non-technical people, leaders, can actually help the organization and the team create a successful environment for Scrum. So when we often talk about Scrum, we implement Scrum, we don't implement Scrum in just like a bubble. We implement Scrum within a huge organization. And so it means that we need to be, to create the environment around it that will make it successful. And so if we follow these principles, if we focus on making these principles a reality for our team in the organization, Scrum will work well. I think there is no question in there, you know. And all of these principles are not necessarily are like separate thing, that like a separate framework that needs to be implemented. I think those are just good principles that you can implement alongside any other framework or method you might be implementing right now in your team. So that's kind of where it comes back to. Yeah. And as you can see, this is why I didn't make a video. I've just been talking for like 40 minutes and I only covered the cultural practices. We still have the technical practices. And so when we go to the technical practices, I guess this is where it can get a bit complicated, right, for us if you're not a technical person. But what I think is important is that you understand what those terms mean and kind of what they represent. so that when you're talking to developers, you actually are able to provide the right advice. You're able to direct them without like telling them how to do it. Like, oh, you have to use this platform to do whatever you're doing, but instead talk about the concepts, right, that we want to create. And so we'll go back to those principles, right? And the first way, going back in the same, we have 3 ways: principles of flow, feedback, continuous improvement. And we start with principles of flow. We have technical practices of flow, right, that help us. And that comes back to those CI/CD topics, right, that I quickly talked about at the beginning of this. And some of the things that they talk about here are things like deployment pipeline, right? So that we have a on-demand, easy to set up deployment pipeline that can be used by the developers. We are trying to reduce handoffs with that, where developers don't have to go and ask operations to create like a QA environment so that they can test their work, but instead they're able to do that themselves. So we are making the flow, like making the work much easier for them, so that they are able to build whatever they're building and get it to the end, test it, right? So deployment pipeline is something that we want to have, that basically means that the developers can easily create development, tests, and production environments or production-like environments to make their to validate that what they're working on is actually working. Sorry. Need to reply real quick in here. Great. Then we have automated testing. And so a lot of the times DevOps is associated with just like basically automation. But that's just one of the technical practices. So we are encouraging teams to automate as much as possible, because we want to reduce the amount of time that they are using to test and still elevate the quality and make sure that everything actually works well. And so we often say that Scrum is impossible without automation. This is because if we're trying to kind of put everything within one sprint, that the team is able to complete all of the work within one sprint, often what happens, the teams would spend like 15% developing and then 85% testing, right? So we're trying to make that testing part much easier to do, so that there isn't even a question of whether do we test it or not. We have all of it automated, right? And obviously we want to make sure that even though we are adding a lot of that automation, that our pipeline is quick, right? So a few teams actually that I worked with, it would take them 4 hours to get a build. And then at the end of the 4 hours, it might be broken, right? And so it means that they have just spent 4 hours waiting and it's not working, right? It's extremely frustrating. And when you're adding a lot of that testing, you need to be mindful of keeping it fast, right? Yeah, so they talk about continuous integration and testing. That is a controversial topic. I think a lot of people say that continuous integration and testing is really bad, and they mention it here as well. So you probably will see that not everybody is for continuous integration and testing. So basically it's something that we constantly are kind of pushing our code as small pieces as possible into their pipeline. We build and test. So there are some challenges that are associated with that. So some people don't think it's a good idea. In this book, they encourage it. That's kind of one of the things. And then they're talking about making the releases low risk, making it easy for a team to to release something into the hands of the customer. There are some of the different techniques and practices that can be implemented in there, making sure that it is architectured in such a way that it is low risk. They're talking about well-defined APIs, interfaces, so that everybody is aligned on the same page when they're building whatever they're building. They're talking about Strangler application pattern. That's a bit too technical. Won't be able kind of going into that. And then they talk about automation again. So automating the release, right? So the deployment process, we talked about it, the deployment pipeline. Oh, yes. And this one is that what they're talking about is to kind of separate releasing into the customer's hands versus deploying the work. So what it means is that we can be deploying in an environment that looks like production, right? Production-like environment to verify that it works, but we do not give it immediately into the hands of the customers, right? And only when we are ready, we can do that. And the way some of the techniques they would use are like feature toggles, right? When we push out the work into, so it's in production, but customers don't have access to it because we have basically said, well, this feature exists in the code, but right now it is turned off, so customers cannot use it. And then we can start turning it on, and we can start turning it on for just certain parts or certain groups of customers, right? Or users. And so we can gradually test it. Well, first, maybe we will just open it up to the people, like internal people who will be testing. Then we'll open it up to bigger audience, right? So that we can make sure that we are still at a good performance and that everything works, right? And if something stops working, there is a problem, we just turn it off. We have a feature toggle, like we just toggle it off and it's fine. And then the other one they talk about, the technical practice, it's called blue-green deployment. And basically it means you have constantly two exactly the same production environments, right? And so one of them is the one that the customers are currently using. So it's active. And then the other one is it lives and exists. It's exactly the same as the one that is active, but it's just inactive. And so you are building whatever you're building, you're delivering it into that inactive system. And then what you do, you just basically turn this one off and turn this one on, right? And then basically you're switching them out. And blue-green means which one. Blue is the one that is sitting behind and is inactive, and green is the one that is being used by the customers and it has customers have direct access to. And so that minimizes the risk, because if we deploy something and it breaks, whatever, it's okay, because the main environment is still working. Customers can still use our product. The only environment we have broken is the one that has been inactive. So that's another one. So blue-green deployment, another technical practice. So that's the flow. And basically, as you can see, what is the flow? Well, we are trying to make that flow as smooth as possible for the developers to get something into the hands of the customers, you know? So, yeah. I don't know if you guys are already falling asleep or if you have any questions in there on this topic. It is getting complicated, this topic. What I'll try to do is to create a write-up of this topic on the website, kind of saying, creating a non-tech explanation of the DevOps Handbook with some of that technical language that I mentioned. But even before reading this book, actually, I already knew these things like deployment pipeline. I already knew what blue-green deployment is I already knew what feature toggle is, because when I was working with the developers, I would hear those things and I would, ask, hey, tell me what it means. And that actually allowed me to kind of read through this book pretty easily. Like, I would see words that are super technical. If you ask me to make it, like to create the actually like a deployment pipeline, I would have no idea how to do that. But I know what it is. Like, I have an understanding of what it is. So it was pretty easy to actually read this book for me. So the second way for the technical practices, remember, the second way is the principles of feedback. So technical practices, what kind of technical practices do we want to implement to help us create the feedback loop? Well, a lot of the things that they talk about in this part is about telemetry, which is basically collecting as many metrics as possible and reviewing them on a regular basis. And so they talk about a lot of different applications that you can use that will basically pull the information from your deployment pipelines, from your code repositories, all of that, and will create graphs represented like in a beautiful way. They talk about how to set it up. And the idea here is not that we are like looking at 10,000 metrics. No, what we're trying to see if there are any unexpected variations. So if we have a pretty stable flow of, I don't know, the number of bugs that is being created every time, then we should be fine. But if we see a spike, then immediately we can say, okay, there is a problem, we need to do something, right? And so they're trying to collect as many metrics as possible. So they talk about how to automate this process, because obviously if you make it difficult to collect the metrics, then nobody's going to do it, right? And so they talk about ways of how you can allow developers to insert like the code into what they're doing so that that can be easily picked up by all of those applications to track those metrics, right? And they talk about like crazy dashboards with like thousands of different metrics. And they would have basically things implemented in that telemetry that will just notify them when something is wrong. When something is out of order, they will get a notification. So it's not like you need to go and review 1,000 metrics every day. And obviously, when you have those metrics, it allows you to not only, it allows you to understand where the problem is and focus your problem solving very specifically on the problem area, right? And so because you have the metric that can show you exactly what you need to look into. And there are lots of different things and examples of what you can do. And they basically say, measure everything, evaluate everything. And so the telemetry is that important part. Analyzing it regularly. Obviously, basically use mean and standard deviation to detect potential problems, right? Instrument and alert on undesired outcomes. So those are some of the things that you want to do. So that enables feedback. They talk about hypothesis-driven development and A/B testing into the daily work, where they kind of focus more on that experimentation. So hypothesis-driven, where they create a hypothesis and say, I think that if we develop this is what's going to happen. And then they try to do it and see whether their hypothesis has been correct. So that is another one. A/B testing is I know what A/B testing is if you're, say, building a website, right? You're tracking, you basically have two different versions, and you are, say, giving it to people like 50-50. So 50% of people are seeing this version and 50% seeing this version. And then you track which one is the best one. So in the same way, they're doing this A/B testing. What's the name of the book? It's this. It's DevOps Handbook. It is a pretty big book, I'll tell you. If you're not technical, there are some parts that you can definitely skip when they talk about like more specifically how to set it up. But yeah, 100% recommend it. If you want to also read more of business novel type of book that talks about the same concept, check out the Phoenix Project and the Unicorn Project. That is written by the same people. And I'll put it in the chat, okay? Phoenix Project. Oh God, I hope you're not seeing it here now. Okay, perfect. Yeah, and then the other metrics are creating and review, kind of creating processes where people review each other's work and coordinate together so that you can increase the quality of the work overall. And some of the easy things that they talk about are peer reviews. Honestly, it's been a while I haven't worked with a team that didn't have peer reviews of their code. Usually that just became such a standard practice, right? Where one developer writes a code, they create a pull request, and then they ask other developers on their team to review it and to make any comments of how they can improve it, or maybe they made a mistake or they didn't follow the guidelines, whatever that is. And then they talk about pair programming. Also, another practice that we are familiar with. Pair programming, where two people are working on the same item together. So you have knowledge transfer. They learn from each other, especially if you have like a senior dev with a junior dev, you know. They also talk about minimizing or even eliminating change approval processes because they say it slows down development, it creates a lot of frustration, and if you have the right culture in mind, if you have telemetry implemented already, it's okay not to have the extra approvals because you will be able to detect problems pretty quickly. Yeah, and fearlessly cut bureaucratic processes. That's one of those things. Like, it is under technical practices, but in a way, it's also just a normal thing to do if we are trying to implement agile ways of working. Bureaucracy is definitely not helping, so we should eliminate it. And the third way, the last way, are the technical practices of continual learning and experimentation, or in simple terms, continuous improvement. And so they talk about some of here is where they actually talk less about talk less about technical stuff and much more about some of the process stuff. So they call it technical practices, but honestly, I think the most technical practices are in the principles of flow in the first way. Okay, maybe in telemetry too. So the third way, the practices of continuous improvement, enable and inject learning into daily work. So it's about creating a learning culture. Here's where they talk about blameless post-mortems. So what they say, if there is a problem, something happened, right? We fix the problem first, obviously. And then right after it has been fixed, while our memories are still fresh, we need to do the blameless post-mortem, where we identify what happened, what are the issues that occurred that brought us to that problem without blaming anyone. And we also, not only that, but we actually make the results of those discussions accessible to anyone in the company, right? So anyone who wants to learn from our mistakes can do that, right? So publish post-mortems as widely as possible to the whole organization. They talk about failures again. So talking about we want to make failure more acceptable. And instead of looking at it as a failure, we look at it as a learning opportunity. Inject production failures to enable resilience and learning. So I talked about it where we are actually trying to break our system to find any gaps and fix them before someone else breaks our system. And they're also talking about game days to rehearse failures. Kind of like a hackathon to break our system, you know? So that's another way. Just some ideas of how you can do that. They talk about making, we talked about it at the beginning, right? The cultural practice, making tacit knowledge available to the whole organization. So we are trying to make any kind of discoveries, especially when it comes to postmortems, clearly like just available for everybody else in the organization so that they can learn from it too. They talk a lot about automation, like automate capturing organizational knowledge, like for example, chatbots or AI can gather a lot of that information, maybe create summaries, automate, well, they obviously didn't have AI when they wrote it, but now we can. Automate standardized processes in software for reuse. So if you have very simple processes, so instead of for every team creating it on their own, we are able to kind of give it to them. So that library of knowledge is readily accessible to everyone. Create a single shared resource, create a single shared source code repository for the entire organization so that everybody uses the same libraries, the same standards. And that basically makes it much easier for the whole organization to really operate. And nobody needs to like create their own library or their own way of building the product. They talk about communities of practice. They talk about creating like a reusable operations user stories into development. So something that if we know that we need to continuously do something like every month, we have like a reusable, well-explained work item that we don't have to recreate it every single time. We know exactly what needs to be done. And then they have reserved time to create organizational learning and improvement. Again, reserving time. Institutionalize rituals to pay down technical debt. And as I think I said in some of my, not sure when, in one of my videos, they actually recommend putting aside 20% of team's time on technical debt every single time. So if you're doing sprints, making sure that every sprint you take in some of the technical debt work. So that's kind of what you want to do. Yeah. And then once again, they talk about the communities of practice and the centers of excellence. Again, not necessarily things that are technical. And so that really summarizes it. That's pretty much what DevOps is about. Of course, there are some more specific technical practices in here. I'm just opening up my other notes in here that go more into details. Like I think I skipped a huge part on telemetry because they were just going into graphs and stuff like that. I'm like, I understood the concept because I'm not going to be setting it up myself. That's okay. I don't need to know that. They have a lot of great case studies from big companies, Amazon, Google, Netflix, all of the great examples that you can learn from. And a lot of them are talking about that positive culture. So the cultural changes that they're creating. And so when we're looking into what is DevOps online and we only find technical stuff, it is kind of sad for me that DevOps became just how to set up cloud environments, deployment pipelines, and how to create automated tests, because there's much more than just those technical practices. It's just part of it, right? And so as a Scrum Master, you can use that knowledge to help your teams, and by creating that environment around them where if they decide to implement it, it will actually work, right? And then facilitation, we're talking about blameless post-mortems, improvement opportunities like retrospectives. They talk about reviews in here. They mentioned product owner in their book, product owner role. So yeah, a lot of the things that definitely can be helpful. So that really is a summary. I think the only last part that they have is where they explain where to start, kind of how to start your transformation. But I don't think that it is as important to the concept of DevOps in general. But yeah. So this is it. Yeah. Are there any questions from you guys? If anything that you would like me to cover, I can stay a little bit. I know I went a little bit over time for what I wanted to spend here today, but as I said, that's a lot of information. But really, what I just told you, that is the summary of what you can find in this book. So, yeah. When we're looking, I'm just trying to find kind of a good meme that would explain it, but it's in the same way, right? People only take a small part of what is really important, and they are not really understanding the whole point of this approach. So it's more of like an approach. Awesome, Randall. Okay, I'm glad that you stuck up until the end. Yeah, thank you. For those of you who are also stayed, as usual, this will be posted. This stream will be posted as the whole stream. What I want to do is actually create a little write-up. I already have a lot of that write-up in here on the website, and probably we'll add this stream in there. We probably will be also creating small clips out of the stream, but that usually takes extra time. So if you couldn't, I guess, check out the whole stream, we will have the recording so you can come back and review it. So yeah. Great. I think I'm going to be wrapping it up here. And as usual, I hope to see you in the next stream. I'm not sure when I'm going to have it. I'm actually enjoying having these streams. Maybe in a couple of weeks, I will be doing another one, if possible. I think it's just kind of nice for me to jump in here. I probably will be moving them to earlier though, because it is like almost end of my lunch break technically right now, and I have a meeting in 15 minutes. So I probably would want to finish around 12. So I'm probably will start doing those around 11. I think that would be a better time. Though, yeah, of course, Randall. Though I am also thinking that you guys are probably attending these streams during your lunch break, right? Let me know in the comments what you think of whether we should, I should change the time in any way, or if it still works. Silvanus is asking, how does knowledge of DevOps help the Scrum Master? Okay, so how does knowledge of DevOps help the Scrum Master is, first of all, it can help you, I think, create good relationships with the developers because, well, Scrum Masters are normally not technical. knowing this and understanding these concepts, I think will earn you some more respect amongst the developers, that you understand these concepts. And also, in the end, it comes back to the same principles as Scrum. So if you have people who really hate Scrum, great. You can strip away all of the Scrum stuff and maybe focus on just the principles that are in DevOps, right? And then that is more, I guess, more aligned in the cultural sense with what developers are looking for. So I think that's kind of how it can definitely help you. Awesome. Thank you so much for attending. And I will be closing the stream, hoping to grab a little bite of something before my meeting. And looking forward to talking to you again.